Alright, welcome back everybody. So last time we were talking about the difference between rural and urban settlements. Today we're going to zoom in on rural settlements and look at a couple of things to do with the rural settlements. So to begin with, remember that rural settlements mean there's some form of primary activity taking place there, like agriculture, forestry, fishing or mining. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to go through three of the modules, hopefully, and the first one will be how site and situation would affect where the settlement is. Unit 5 will be how we classify rural settlements based on their shapes, and the last one will be how do we judge the land use of settlements. Let's get into the first one real quick. Now, we're going to look quickly at the physical factors that affect why rural settlements are located where they are. People don't just live in random places without thinking about it. So the physical factors refer to things like the climate, the soil, the geology, the weather, and some of the things that people need to survive. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some basically Google Earth pictures of each of these just now. The first one is obviously people want to be located near to water for farming and drinking, and if you were located near to a site like a river, a lake, a underground spring, we would call that settlement a wet point site. But if you were trying to avoid water, like if you lived in a marshy riverbank or floodplain and the settlement was located further from that, we would call that a dry point site. You can see that the third one would be a farming factor. So farming factors would be things like arable land, fertile soil. Then we'll move on to the availability of things that you could build a house with, like trees or rock or stone. Energy resources being also things like coal, maybe trees as well, so that you could cut them and make fire. Then the second last one will be the positive effects of microclimates, which means north-facing slopes, taking into account the inversion layer in the middle of the valley, and making sure you avoid those katabatic winds that could cool down the frost pocket at night. And the final one is relief. So you can't live on a cliff face, you have to live on land that is fairly flat. So the first example of a settlement I will give you is from Eshowe in KZN, which is just a great example of why people would live near a river. So this settlement has rivers kind of flanking it on the western side, and then the Mtsilombo River flows to the south, and then up the side, and there's another little tributary there. So the whole settlement has a great access to water, which makes it very easy to understand why that settlement is there. The next one we'll move on to was an example also from KwaZulu-Natal, which is near in the Mweni Valley, which I've actually been to. It's near the Drakensberg. And this is firstly a great example of a braided river channel. So the Mweni River meanders through this valley and splits up and forms this really nice braided pattern, and a floodplain. You can clearly see the floodplain on either side of the river. And this is great arable land. You can see there are a whole lot of little settlements alongside the banks of the Mweni River, very flat, very fertile. There's lots of land, lots of grazing land for cattle and livestock, but also lots of nice farming land for crops. And that makes it easy to understand why there are all these little settlements located along the banks of the Mweni River. It's a really beautiful place. This is a shot from Lesotho. I think it's southwest of Thaba Tseka, and this is in the Lesotho Highlands. The Lesotho Highlands, we know, it gets freezing cold, and because of its high altitude, has very cold winters, and even in the nighttime it gets very cold. So if you look at Lesotho from a satellite image, a lot of the settlements are on the north-facing slope, which we know in the southern hemisphere. The north-facing slopes will receive more direct sunlight, which means they are warmer. So that means people would rather live on the north-facing slope to receive this more direct sunlight and have a warmer conditions than the south-facing slope, which, as you can see, there's no houses on the south-facing slope. And all through Lesotho, you can see in the highlands especially, the north-facing slopes are where settlements are predominantly located, whereas the south-facing slopes there's no settlements in most cases. So people have known this for thousands of years, that the north-facing slope is the warmest, and Lesotho is a great example of that. With favorable microclimates, we also need to think of things like the inversion layer. So people will not build houses in the valley, on the valley floor or at the very tops of the mountains, because we know that those are very cold sites, and we know that people should build their houses to be warm in that inversion layer, which would be halfway up the valley slopes. Now, in most cases, there are still houses in the valley floor, but we do often find houses built halfway up the slopes of the mountain, and we would take all of these into account when seeing why settlements are built where they are. Things like people would build where it's north facing to be warm. They'd build in the inversion layer so that they would be warm at night. They would also build in a place where it was sheltered by wind, because we do not want strong winds to cool us down or blow away or stop our crops from growing because of strong winds. So that's what we mean by favorable microclimates. Okay, so then we get onto the economic factors. So now we've dealt with the physical things, which is about the climate of the soil and the relief of the land. But now we look at the economic factors. So there's three of those. The first one is, well, if there's a place with fertile soil, arable land, well-drained soil, and maybe grazing land, this would be a great place for rural settlements to begin. We're going to look at an example of that. The next one is if there is a harbor or maybe some fisheries like a crayfish or even some other fish, some edible fish, then that would be a great place for rural settlements to spring up. And the last one is if there's a tourist attraction or an ecotourism attraction, then it would make sense for rural areas to spring up around that. The first example we're going to look at for the fertile soil will be Stellenbosch. The second one with the natural harbour, we'll look at Elandsbaai in the Western Cape, and then the last one we'll look at, for tourism, we'll look at Skukuza, which is just on the border, which is in the Kruger National Park. Right, so this is Stellenbosch, a great example of an area that has good relief, which means it's very flat. It has very fertile soil for grazing and for growing vineyards and other agriculture, and as you can see from the map, you can see many commercial farms springing up in this area. So that is a great economic reason for why there are all these rural settlements around Stellenbosch. We can see the urban area, but the rural area of Stellenbosch is also very clear on this map. That's because of its well-drained soil and fertile ground for grazing and agriculture. The next example, as I said, was Elandsbaai, which is in the Western Cape, and you can see how this this kind of rural lands, rural settlements that have sprung up towards the kind of eastern side of Elandsbaai, and that was because there's a very productive fishing industry right near the sea, and a slightly protected little bay as well. The last one we'll look at for this one was Skukuza Rest Camp, and as you know, the Kruger National Park is a global tourist destination, so Skukuza has grown and developed from this rural... Big lightning storm. Skukuza has grown and developed based on that tourist industry. Now we get to the second unit which we're looking at today, which is how do we classify rural settlements based on their shape. And we will again look at some examples from Google Earth. This just gives you a quick rundown. Obviously the isolated one is probably hidden behind my head, so we can't really view that one. The first one we'll look at is the center one, which is the nucleated settlement pattern, which means buildings clustered around a central location. You can see on the left there the dispersed pattern means houses separated from each other, but there's still quite a few of them. A linear settlement would be where there are houses and settlements located along either a river or a road. An isolated one behind me, you can't really see it, is a single settlement that's located far from anyone else. The first one we'll get into is what does nucleated actually look like. Nucleated will look like a single cluster of houses or farmsteads in a little grouping, okay? And you can see there's a nucleated settlement right in the middle there. So nucleated means very clustered and very close together, whether it's one or many. The second case would be a dispersed pattern. This is from the Eastern Cape, and you can see there are many, many houses here. They're not necessarily isolated from each other, but they are spread out over in quite a regular pattern. So dispersed means not clustered together, but instead there's fairly equal spacing, or they are spaced out more regularly. Some of the advantage of this, which we'll go back to the nucleated one, the advantage of being a nucleated settlement is that you can share your resources and that it is more secure. So you can share machinery and tools, and it is more safe to be around other people. Whereas the benefits of being in a dispersed settlement pattern are that you have more privacy, you have more space to conduct your own activities. The downside is that there is maybe a risk of crime, and that you cannot really rely on other people too much. Okay, and then the final example of that would be an isolated, well, not the final, there are some others, is an isolated settlement pattern. This is from the Northern Cape, where you've got a single settlement located very, very far from anything else. There's no nearby settlements, and that is when you've just got a solitary settlement or settlements that are very far from one another. Those would be classified as isolated settlements. Then we have some other shapes that we'll look at, the first being the crossroads settlements. You can see this is also from Eastern Cape, where you've got this R61 road meeting another road going north to south, and then a little rural settlement has sprung up at the junction of these two roads. So this could be called a crossroads, or sometimes an X-shaped settlement pattern. Then a T-junction is fairly self-explanatory. It's where you have two roads joining at right angles. And in this case, a little settlement has sprung up where the one road meets the other, and this little rural settlement has sprung up quite nicely over there. Okay, so let's look now at the final unit is the land use in these two, in rural versus urban, in rural settlements, but in terms of subsistence versus commercial agriculture. So the land use that we find in rural areas will either be subsistence or it'll be commercial. And you learned from a long time ago that subsistence means growing food for yourself and for your family, and maybe making a bit of extra money selling that food that you grow at a market. Whereas commercial farming is strictly for profit, and it has these vast tracts of land. So if you look at the subsistence side of things, subsistence is usually smaller plots of land, and usually the settlements in the areas will be nucleated, so people will live very close together. Small farmers will live close together, whereas commercial farming will be on a massive scale. There will be very dispersed settlements because the plots of land are so huge. And you can even see from this picture, the tractors driving through this massive property, and you can usually tell by the size of the property whether it is commercial or subsistence. Large properties or large rural sections of farming would be commercial, whereas very small clustered farms would indicate that it is a subsistence farming area. And the two examples we're going to use now are from Mozambique, in the region of Beira, which was devastated by a tropical cyclone a few years back, and we can find two of these exact same rural, we'll find two distinct uses from the rural land use in Beira. So this is an example just north of the river in Beira of a small scale farming, of subsistence farming, where you've got these tiny little clusters of farms that are fairly ordered but very small. So you can tell that the small size means people are just growing enough food for themselves and their families. They're not massive commercial properties. And you can see that by, there's not a lot of evidence of things like big water tanks or irrigation pipes or tractors or massive barns or big farmhouses or big fences. There's none of that. There's just some evidence of maybe some kind of small buildings, but that's where the infrastructure ends. Whereas if we compare this, and these two sites are actually very close together. They're probably they're just a few kilometers apart. So this is the subsistence farming, but then just to the northwest of this area in Beira, you've got these massive commercial farming lands. So if you compare these, you can see that firstly, this is on a similar scale as well. These are massive, massive tracts of land, and they're all probably share a similar owner. So it's not made up of many owners like this piece of land. It is a single distinct huge part of land. And you can see there's a lot of evidence of some irrigation in the circular region in the center, and there are also some relatively large buildings in the just to the northeast of that center point as well. So that shows us that this would be a commercial area. And you can also see there are not many small roads going between there. A couple of roads for maybe some kind of vehicles to travel on. And that brings us to the end of this chapter 2, which means that we will begin in the next section to look at the problems that rural areas face. Thank you very much. See you next time.